Back in Berlin, things were different. The atmosphere inside the Abwehr headquarters was tense, heavy with mistrust. The SS and Himmler's SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, had begun encroaching on our operations. They believed we were too independent, too unreliable. Canaris was under constant surveillance. We were soldiers, but now we were being watched like criminals. Every misstep could be fatal. I remember one evening in 1942 when Canaris called me into his office. He looked older, his eyes tired. "They're listening to everything," he whispered, "even in here. From now on, speak as if every wall has ears." He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a transfer order. My division was to move to the Eastern Front headquarters at Königsberg. He smiled faintly. "You'll be safer there, and we'll need your reports more than ever." In Königsberg, my duties shifted from planning to survival. We were now not only fighting the Soviets, but the political chaos within our own ranks. Every week brought a new directive from Berlin, a new set of impossible demands. The Führer's orders no longer matched the realities on the ground. We knew it. Everyone did. But saying so aloud was dangerous. In 1943, as Stalingrad fell, the mood in our department changed completely. The defeat was more than a military loss, it was an intelligence disaster. We had underestimated the enemy's capacity, his morale, his willingness to sacrifice. Thousands of our men were captured, including field officers who knew too much. I received a report that the Soviets had begun extracting information about our radio networks in the Baltic. We were forced to dismantle entire operations overnight. Around that time, I began to cooperate secretly with a small circle of officers who no longer believed victory was possible. Some of them were connected to the resistance against Hitler. We didn't speak openly of it, but we shared the same fear. If the war continued, Germany would be destroyed. Still, my role was to keep working, keep sending reports, keep the machinery moving, even as the ground crumbled beneath us. In the spring of 1944, one of my agents brought word of Soviet preparations for Operation Bagration, a massive offensive aimed at destroying Army Group Center. I sent the report to Berlin immediately, warning that if our lines didn't reposition, the entire front would collapse. It was ignored. When the attack came in June, it was worse than anything we had imagined. Hundreds of thousands of our soldiers were encircled and wiped out in weeks. Our intelligence network in the East was obliterated. That was the moment I realized the war was lost. Not in Berlin, not in Normandy, but in the forests of Belarus. The Red Army had learned from us. They now used deception, maskirovka, against us, feeding false signals, creating phantom divisions, staging fake retreats. It was as if I was watching a mirror version of myself, a machine I had once designed turned against me. When Canaris was arrested in 1944 for his alleged role in the July 20 plot against Hitler, we all knew what would happen next. The Abwehr was dismantled. Many of my colleagues disappeared overnight. Some were executed at Flossenburg. I was summoned to Berlin, interrogated, and then quietly reassigned to a technical advisory post under the Foreign Armies East Intelligence Division, now controlled by the SS. They didn't trust me, but they still needed my mind. I stayed alive by being useful, an old trick in our trade. By early 1945, as the Reich collapsed, my department operated out of a cellar in Berlin. We burned files daily, destroying everything that could link names, codes, or networks. I watched our empire of secrets vanish in smoke. When the Soviets began closing in, I was ordered to relocate to Bavaria. But by then, it was chaos. Roads clogged with refugees, convoys shattered by Allied bombers. On the night of April 28th, I left Berlin for the last time. I took nothing but a small satchel containing a few papers and my identity card. I remember looking back once, seeing the city glowing red against the horizon. For all its madness, it had been my home. 2 weeks later, I was in American hands. But that was not the end. It was only the beginning of a different kind of war. One fought not with armies, but with information, with memory, and with silence.
When I look back now, I still wonder how I managed to survive it all. I was born into a country already trembling with the aftershocks of the First World War. Germany in the 1910s was hungry, bitter, and desperate to rise again. I came of age in the shadow of defeat, among men who had lost everything except their pride. Perhaps that's why I was drawn to intelligence work. In the world of secrets and deception, a ruined nation could still wield power. By 1939, when the world erupted again, I was no longer the young officer I had once been. I was a Brigadier General, serving within the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. My task was not to fight on the front lines, but to see everything, to learn the enemy's movements before our troops even knew they existed, to make sure Germany was never again caught blind, as it had been in 1918. The Abwehr was a strange world. We were soldiers, yes, but we didn't wear our loyalty on our sleeves. We worked in shadows, between politics and warfare, between loyalty and survival. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, our chief, was a man I respected deeply. Brilliant, secretive, and cautious. To some, he was a patriot. To others, a traitor. But all of us knew one thing. In his eyes, victory was not worth losing our humanity. My own focus was the East. My division was responsible for Soviet intelligence, collecting reports, decoding messages, infiltrating agents behind the Red Army's lines. In those early years, we were confident. Too confident. Our spies brought back thousands of reports about troop movements near Smolensk, about fuel depots in Ukraine, about the structure of the NKVD's counterintelligence. Many of these reports shaped Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. I still remember that morning, June 22nd. Our radio intercepts lit up with confusion as Soviet stations went silent one by one. The German columns rolled across the border like a living machine, tanks, infantry, aircraft filling the skies. At headquarters, the air was electric. We thought it would be over in months. Moscow by Christmas, they said. We believed it. We all did. My agents were some of the first to cross the frontier. Men and women trained for years to live double lives in the East. They carried forged Soviet papers, learned to curse in Russian, to drink like locals, to disappear in the chaos. I had handpicked many of them myself. Some were adventurers. Some believed in the Reich. Others simply wanted to survive. Most would never return. By August, reports from the front became darker. The Red Army was retreating, yes, but not collapsing. Soviet counterintelligence was relentless. One of my best officers, an Austrian named Heller, vanished near Minsk. Another, codenamed Sneg, was captured by the NKVD and later used to feed us false information. That was the cruelest part of the job. not knowing whether the man speaking on the radio was still yours or an enemy using his voice. Our biggest success came in late 1941, when we intercepted messages indicating that Stalin planned to move his industrial base beyond the Urals. That single revelation changed everything. Hitler had assumed that once Moscow fell, the Soviet war machine would crumble. But we saw the truth. Factories were being dismantled and moved eastward, beyond the reach of our Luftwaffe. It meant one thing. The Soviets were preparing for a long war. I reported this to Berlin. My superiors dismissed it as defeatist nonsense. That was when I first began to see the cracks in the system. As the winter of 1941 set in, I visited the front near Vyazma. The snow was waist-deep, the cold biting through our uniforms. I watched soldiers burn fuel barrels just to stay alive. Entire divisions frozen in the fields. It wasn't just the men who were breaking. The intelligence lines were too. Our code books were compromised. Soviet partisans ambushed our couriers. Our wireless operators froze in makeshift huts, tapping out reports on dying batteries. In those conditions, intelligence became improvisation. We relied on captured documents, interrogations, whispers from the occupied villages. Some of the most valuable information came from terrified Soviet deserters. They told us about new tank designs, about factories in Chelyabinsk, about the movement of entire armies hidden behind the Volga. It was there I learned the first mention of something called the T-34, a tank that would soon haunt our generals for the rest of the war.
When I was captured in May of 1945, the war was over, but none of us knew what peace would mean. I was taken by a group of American soldiers near the town of Rosenheim in Bavaria. They searched my satchel, found the papers I'd hidden, nothing incriminating, just notes on Soviet formations and a list of old contacts. They didn't know who I really was. To them, I was just another officer trying to surrender. They placed me in a temporary camp near Augsburg. Thousands of us crowded behind barbed wire. Generals, clerks, engineers, men who had served an empire that no longer existed. The Americans treated us decently, though they were cautious. Every day, teams of intelligence officers arrived, asking the same questions: names, ranks, responsibilities, and knowledge of war crimes. I answered carefully, revealing enough to appear cooperative, but not enough to endanger myself or those who had once worked under me. It was during one of these interrogations that an American officer, a colonel from the Counterintelligence Corps, noticed something in my file. "You worked under Canaris?" he asked. I nodded. His tone shifted. "Then you're not just another soldier." Within a week, I was transferred to a smaller facility for high-value intelligence personnel. They wanted information on the Soviet Union. It was the new obsession. Barely weeks after the war, the lines between enemy and ally were already shifting. The Americans had realized what we had known for years. The Soviets were preparing to dominate Europe. At first, I refused to cooperate. I was tired, disillusioned, haunted by everything I had seen and done. But the Americans were persistent. They offered protection, food, and a chance to avoid extradition to the Soviets. That last part mattered. I had heard what happened to captured German intelligence officers handed over to Moscow. Torture, disappearances. There would be no trials, no records, only silence. So, I agreed to talk. At first, just about technical matters, the structure of the Red Army, the tactics we had observed, the NKVD's field protocols. But soon, the conversations became longer, more personal.
They wanted to know how we had built networks behind Soviet lines, how we recruited agents, how we broke codes. I realized something then. They weren't just debriefing me, they were studying me. One night, a man in civilian clothes came to my quarters. He spoke fluent German, without arrogance. My name isn't important, but I represent an organization that's still being formed. America is entering a new kind of conflict. You can help us win it. He was from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime precursor to what would soon become the CIA. They needed experts on the Soviets, and no one knew the Eastern Front like we did. The Americans were pragmatic. They didn't care about ideology as long as you could deliver results. It was unsettling, but also strangely familiar. Intelligence has no friends, only interests. I was moved to a safe house in Wiesbaden under the supervision of a joint American-British team. My name disappeared from prisoner rosters. I became consultant number 47. From there, I began to reconstruct everything I knew: Soviet command hierarchies, airfield locations, logistical patterns, even the habits of Soviet generals. I drew maps from memory: rivers, supply routes, partisan zones. It felt like rebuilding a ghost empire out of ashes. In 1946, I was quietly released under a new identity. The Americans had arranged papers and accommodation in Munich. Officially, I was a technical advisor helping with post-war reconstruction. Unofficially, I was preparing detailed reports on Soviet operations in Eastern Europe. It wasn't long before they asked me to help with something larger: an operation to recruit former German officers for intelligence work against the East. The Americans called it Operation Rusty. The idea was simple. We had thousands of experienced analysts and field operatives who knew the Soviets better than anyone. The Americans were pragmatic. They didn't care about ideology as long as you could deliver results. It was unsettling, but also strangely familiar. Intelligence has no friends, only interests.
By 1947, I was in contact with other former Abwehr officers. Many of them had survived by sheer luck. Some were bitter, others eager for redemption. Together we began to build what became known as the Gehlen Organization, named after General Reinhard Gehlen, who had been my superior in the Foreign Army's East Division. Gehlen himself had surrendered to the Americans and offered his entire archive of intelligence on the Soviet Union in exchange for protection and freedom. It was a bargain that shaped the next 40 years of global politics. Under American supervision, our new organization operated from a secure compound in Pullach, near Munich. It was technically part of U.S. Army intelligence, but in practice it became the backbone of post-war West Germany's espionage network, the future Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND. We built it from nothing. Old typewriters, captured Soviet maps, and the surviving fragments of our wartime files. We had informants in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. Some were refugees, others were former Wehrmacht officers who had stayed behind under false identities. They sent reports through secret channels, letters coded in recipes, messages hidden in medical shipments, couriers disguised as priests and traitors. It was the same game as before, only now the flags had changed. Still, the shadows of the past never left us. Many of the men working beside me had dark histories. Some had served in units involved in atrocities on the Eastern Front. The Americans knew it, but they looked away. As long as you were useful against the Soviets, your sins were negotiable. I tried not to think about it, but in quiet moments, the memories returned. Villages burning, prisoners interrogated, orders given and forgotten. We were building a new world on the ruins of the old, and everyone pretended not to notice the blood beneath the foundation. In 1948, the Berlin blockade began. The city that had once been the heart of our empire was now the front line of a new war. Soviet forces surrounded West Berlin, cutting off all supply routes. I was tasked with gathering intelligence on Soviet troop movements and predicting whether Stalin would risk a direct confrontation. Through our contacts in the East, we learned that the blockade was meant to force the Allies out, not start a war. I passed that information to my American handlers. It helped shape their decision to respond with the Berlin airlift instead of open conflict. That was one of the first times I realized how much influence our small group had. The world saw politicians and generals making decisions. Behind them, men like me whispered the data that made those decisions possible. By the early 1950s, I had become a key figure in what was now formally the organization Gehlen. We were feeding reports not only to the Americans, but also to the newly established government in Bonn. It was a strange feeling, working for the same country that once accused me of treason, now under a new flag, a new set of values. The Americans trusted me more than my own people did. They invited me to Washington in 1951, a quiet trip under a false passport. I remember stepping off the plane at National Airport, seeing the Potomac shimmer in the summer light. For a man who once studied the destruction of nations, America felt impossibly alive, untouched, invulnerable. In the Pentagon, I met officers who had fought against us only 6 years earlier. Now we were allies, shaking hands over maps of Eastern Europe, discussing strategies to contain a new enemy. One of them, a former OSS operative named William King, said something that stayed with me. "You Germans built an empire that lasted 12 years. We're trying to build one that lasts a century. The difference is, we'll do it without occupying anyone." I wasn't sure I believed him. Every empire begins with noble intentions. By the 1954, our operations had grown into one of the most extensive intelligence networks in Europe. We had radio outposts in Austria and Norway, listening to Soviet transmissions. We smuggled agents through the Iron Curtain, disguised as migrant workers. We even monitored Soviet nuclear tests in Kazakhstan, using data from captured scientists. But the deeper we went, the more the past returned to haunt us. Rumors began to spread. Accusations that our organization was protecting former SS officers, that we were covering up war crimes under the guise of anti-communism. Some of it was true, some of it wasn't. But in intelligence, perception is as dangerous as proof. I saw men once loyal to each other turn to blackmail and silence. Files disappeared. Lives vanished. The new war was colder, but no less ruthless. By the time the Gehlen Organization officially became the BND in 1956, I had already decided to withdraw. I was 50 years old, tired of secrets, tired of ghosts. They offered me a position in the new structure, but I refused. I had spent my life serving powers that rose and fell like tides. I wanted to disappear before the next one broke. So I left Germany under another name, moved to South America for a few years, then later to the United States. The Americans arranged the paperwork. I became a consultant on Eastern affairs, which was their polite term for an ex-spy they didn't want to lose track of. Sometimes I was called to Washington for briefings. They would ask me my opinion on Soviet policies or how to interpret intelligence from East Berlin. I answered, but each time I felt more detached. The world had changed. Satellites replaced field agents. Computers replaced code books. The new spies sat behind desks, reading machine printouts. The art of human intelligence, the craft I had lived by, was dying. Still, there were moments when I almost admired them. They had learned from our mistakes. They built an intelligence empire that operated not through conquest, but through information, a quiet, invisible power. By the time the 1960s began, I had faded from the official record. My name was buried in classified archives, sealed for decades. I had survived 2 regimes, 2 wars, and 2 worlds. But survival is not victory. It is merely endurance. I often wondered what Canaris would have thought of what we built after his death. The man who once tried to save Germany from itself would have recognized the irony that our old networks, born in secrecy and deception, would become the foundation of the very West that defeated us. But history has no conscience. It only records who was useful at the right time.
By the time I settled in the United States, the war felt like another lifetime. Yet it followed me everywhere. In every headline, every whisper about spies and defections. The Cold War was reaching its height. Berlin was divided by concrete. Moscow and Washington were playing a dangerous game of shadows, and I was quietly living among the very people I once studied from afar. I had an apartment in Georgetown, overlooking the Potomac River. To my neighbors, I was a retired European scholar who occasionally consulted for the government. In truth, I was still part of a world that never really ended. My contacts in the CIA would sometimes visit for long, quiet evenings. They would ask questions about the past that weren't really about the past at all. How the Soviets thought, how they lied, how they calculated risk. They wanted to understand the psychology of an enemy I had once fought face to face. I remember one meeting in 1958. A young analyst asked me, "Do you ever regret what you did?" I looked at him for a long time before answering. "Regret," I said, "is a luxury for men who had choices. I only ever had survival." The truth was, I had done things that haunted me. Not directly, no blood on my hands, but through orders, operations, information that sent men to their deaths. Intelligence is a clean profession on paper. You deal in documents, signals, whispers. But behind every code and every report are lives, families, villages, the invisible cost of every decision. For years, I told myself I was serving Germany, protecting it from chaos. Later, I said I was serving peace by helping America contain the Soviets. Perhaps both were lies. In the early 1960s, I was invited to a private conference in Virginia, a gathering of former intelligence officers from Europe and America. They wanted to exchange insights on psychological warfare. I sat in a room filled with men who had once been enemies, now discussing propaganda as if it were just another scientific field. One British officer raised his glass and said, "Gentlemen, we all fought for different flags, but the same fear." He was right. Fear had driven everything. The fear of losing, of being forgotten, of becoming powerless. And fear, I realized, was the most powerful intelligence tool of all. Nations built entire empires on it. As I aged, I began writing privately, notes, observations, memories that I never intended to publish. I wanted to understand the pattern of my life, how I had moved from the ruins of Berlin to the marble halls of Washington, how I had served both tyranny and democracy without ever truly belonging to either. I came to a conclusion that disturbed me. Every system I had served, Hitler's Reich, the OSS, the early CIA, even the new German state, believed itself to be the guardian of truth. But in intelligence, truth is the first casualty. Every report is a distortion, every secret an illusion. We built our empires on half-truths, and perhaps that is why they always crumble eventually. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of my old American contacts called me. He wanted to know how the Soviets would react to a blockade. I told him, "They will bluff, then they will retreat, but they will never forget." I was right, and that small piece of advice, passed over the phone from a man who no longer officially existed, helped guide decisions that prevented nuclear war.
That night, I sat alone, listening to the radio as the world waited for Armageddon. I realized that after all those years, I was still playing the same game, reading the enemy's mind, predicting their next move, gambling on survival. By the late 1960s, my health began to fail. My lungs, damaged during the final months in Berlin, reminded me daily that time was short. The CIA quietly reduced my assignments. Younger men were taking over, armed with new tools, computers, satellites, analysis teams. The age of the lone field spy was ending. I didn't belong in that world anymore. One day, I walked along the National Mall and watched children running beneath the Capitol dome. They had no idea that their world, their peace, existed only because of invisible wars fought in the shadows, wars I had helped start and later tried to contain. The irony was unbearable. In 1970, I returned briefly to Germany under my real name for the first time since the war. West Germany was prosperous, democratic, unrecognizable. I visited the old Abwehr building in Berlin, what was left of it, and found it had been turned into government offices. I walked the same halls where I had once signed coded orders, and for a moment I felt the weight of history pressing against me. A young civil servant stopped me and asked, politely, if I needed help. I smiled and said, "No, I was just looking for ghosts." In the end, I never stood trial, never faced judgment. My name was buried in archives that, even now, few have opened. Some might say I got away with everything. But what does that mean? I lived with the knowledge that could never be spoken, faces that never left me, loyalties that meant nothing when the war ended. That is not getting away. That is carrying a shadow that never fades. I often think of Admiral Canaris, hanged in a concentration camp only weeks before the war ended. He had tried to act with honor in a dishonorable time. In a way, he succeeded. In another, he failed, just as we all did, because intelligence, for all its brilliance, cannot save a nation that has already lost its soul. Sometimes I still wake in the night, hearing the sound of typewriters, the murmur of coded transmissions, the cold wind over the Eastern Front. It all comes back, the faces of men who trusted me, the agents who never returned. Their names are forgotten by history, but not by me. If there is one lesson to be learned from my life, it is this: the line between loyalty and survival is thinner than a single thread, and once you cross it, you can never go back. The Cold War may have ended, but the machinery we built still runs. Nations still spy, still lie, still build their power on information no one can prove. The faces have changed, the technology has evolved, but the hunger for control, that remains eternal. I am old now, and my time is almost gone. I've told you my story not for redemption, but for understanding. History remembers generals and politicians, but it forgets the men in the shadows, the ones who moved the pieces but never appeared on the board. I was one of those men. I was Germany's top spy. And yes, I got away with everything. But the truth is, no one ever truly gets away. Because in this game, every secret has a cost, and eventually, the bill always comes due. If you've watched till the end, thank you for your time. These stories remind us how history is written not only by victors, but by those who survived its darkness. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love true World War II stories, and comment below what you think about the hidden wars that shaped our world. Subscribe for more forgotten tales from the shadows of history.